welcome everybody. I just wanted to start thanking the organizers of the conference. Oh, I see. I lost my screen there though, my screen share.
That was interesting. Go ahead and try that again, Rich.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I see lots more folks. That's great. How's that? Can you see my screen?
It's coming. There you go.
Yes, you're good to go.
An alien and a dog there on the screen. Great. Yeah, I just wanted to thank the organizers for this invitation. I'm really grateful for it. Sorry I can't be in New Mexico physically. I was there. I spoke at this conference in 2004, I think it was, talking about economic inequality and how it's implicated in domestic violence and what we might think about doing about it. I'd like to think that this presentation is in some ways a little bit of a successor to that one. But one of the things I came away with, because I was there in person, which is always great to come to New Mexico, I got some swag from the conference, which included a deck of cards from Roswell. I always wanted to go to Roswell, and just this past December, I was driving out west to visit my new grandbaby, and we stopped in Roswell, where my faithful pooch, Chessa, who's banished to the bedroom right now because she barks very loudly. And I didn't want that coming in on the broadcast. She got to spend a little time there. As you can see, she looks a little freaked out by the guy standing next to her. But it was great to actually get to Roswell that time as well. And I see I've got to do a little bit of screen changing up here. So I think probably with the exception of David Adams, I think I might have been one of the people at the conference who was one of the earliest folks that started working with people who cause harm in intimate relationships. I started doing that work in 1979 in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm using the term people who cause harm. Back then, we were talking about the term men who batter to refer to the folks that we were working with. Began doing that work before the power and control wheel. It's about 6 or 7 years before even the power and control wheel was issued. I was in Anchorage, Alaska, as I mentioned, and it was the early days of what came to be called the men's movement, which actually splintered into two movements. One was kind of a reactionary men's movement, a men's rights movement, and the other part of that men's movement was came to be called, among other names, like the pro-feminist men's movement. And that was the part of the movement I was aligned with. And I was working at this program, battering intervention program back then. As far as I could glean, there was only one published article about working with men who batter back in those days. I had a mimeographed copy of it. I don't think anybody under 55 on this call is going to even know what a mimeograph was, but that was an early way to copy things before there was widespread photocopy machines. So it was early. And back then, the idea that there would be massive police and criminal legal system response to what was considered a private problem rather than a public human rights issue, it seemed very unlikely. And in Anchorage, back when I was doing those groups, almost all of our participants were so-called voluntary. Their partners were in the shelter and encouraged them to come to the program. There were occasional police arrests that made their way to the program. I was kind of in awe of the military response at that point. There's 2 military installations in Anchorage, and some of the men in the group were sent by their commanding officers. I noted that they were able to tell men that they could no longer live in the community, that they had to live in barracks. They had control over a lot of aspects of their lives, and that seemed really favorable, like a really good way that accountability might be influenced. Hang on one second, sorry, so court mandates, as I said, were relatively rare. We saw our job as the cartoon indicates, as a pro-feminist challenge to be men who were in the movement that were going to challenge other men's male privilege and the things that they did in the name of their privilege, and to help hold men accountable. And that's that's the main motivation I had for lending my time to the battering intervention program. Then as the years passed, with the mutual support of advocates and some research in Minneapolis that purported to show that arrests deterred subsequent violence for people who are causing harm, the criminal legal response to the issue of men's violence against women really exploded. The floodgates of referrals to programs opened. Programs grew from just maybe a couple dozen across the whole country to hundreds and hundreds in the US in a relatively short amount of time. And that represented what I really thought at the time was a great success, and still do think of that as a great success. I think it came at a little bit of a cost though too. When I worked at the Domestic Abuse Project in Minneapolis in 1984, that was the city where those police experiments took place. I remember I encountered a client in my earliest days there who told me the story. He said, oh, I was doing his intake, and he said, oh, it wasn't last Friday, a few months ago, my wife got into it like we usually do on a Friday night. And you know what? She called the police. And he said this kind of incredulously, like, how could she have thought to do that? And he said, and you know what? The police came and they arrested me. And again, it was with the kind of incredulity that might come from someone who did encounter an alien or a spacecraft or something like that. And he said, then I went to work the next week and I was talking to this guy at the plant, and I told him, man, my old lady got me arrested the other night. And he said, that guy turned to me and said, she didn't get you arrested. You got yourself arrested. It's what you did that caused the arrest, not what she did. And that guy happened to be someone who was in the program, and I confronted him. And again, he was really amazed that such a thing could happen. And then he said, oh, and then the day of my court date, I was looking at the paper and I read this article that said the judges and the advocates and the social workers are all going to get together to end domestic violence. And he says, you know what? It's going to work. So I thought, wow, this is an amazing example of what happens when systems pull together and give a coordinated message about the unacceptability of violence in their relationships. So that success transformed the field. Now instead of there was emphasis on survivors being able to call the police and get some help, and not be told, why are you staying, or what did you do to provoke them, or go walk around the block, but actually expect some response, and then some response from the criminal legal system. But even at that point, I think we were aware of the dilemma that we were in, because there was this unfortunate idea that working on pro-feminist gender transformation, how was it going to be that the place to situate that was with a lot of men who held really misogynist kinds of views, and who maybe weren't the best candidates to recruit into a pro-feminist men's movement. And also that there was damage potentially being done when we were using state power and coercion and power and control as a major tool for bringing men into that work. So there was dilemmas and uneasy compromises, but yet the work went forward, and to, I think, some very good effect. There also, though, was another maybe unfortunate outcome of this growth and success, which is that a lot of women began to get caught in the jaws of the criminal legal system, themselves arrested for committing the crime of domestic violence when they themselves were survivors. So our organizing and transformative work, even then, I think we realized something needed to be redirected. So energizing my presentation today are kind of two forms of transformation. One is gender transformative interventions. Those are interventions that actively examine, challenge, and transform the underlying causes of gender inequality that are rooted in inequitable structures and institutions in our society, and that seek to eradicate the systemic forms of gender-based discrimination by creating or strengthening equitable gender norms, dynamics, and systems that support gender equality. I think that's at the center of our work. More recently, our attention has really become focused on ideas of transformative justice. Transformative justice is a framework and approach that responds to violence, harm, and abuse. And at its most basic, it's seeking to respond to violence without creating more violence or engaging in harm reduction to lessen the violence. And this has been energized by concerns about mass incarceration and its devastating impact on communities of color. So there's calls for approaches that we use in our field now, I think, to address domestic violence in ways that don't depend on carceral responses and don't have as great a dependence on the criminal legal system. We need to find ways to situate our interventions that are outside of those systems that cause their own damage and reduce our dependence on them, to at least to achieve this ideal of a more transformative justice process. I see I'm already getting way behind on my time, so I'm going to talk really fast. One of the places that maybe we would think about that intervention outside of the criminal legal system is the potential for engaging men as fathers. And I want to talk a little bit about my work in that area quickly, but I want to name check here Justice Ginsburg, sorely missed, even more sorely missed in recent days, who said that women will only have equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. Gender inequality in intimate caregiving in families is probably the largest contributor to gender inequality in the world, because women do the vast share of family care giving duties, and men don't lean into that share. So changing that is one of the gender transformative processes we need to think about. And that led me to think about doing work with expectant fathers, because there was some research that showed that men who had been abusive previously continued to be abusive during pregnancy, but there were men who weren't abusive prior to the pregnancy who became abusive during the pregnancy. Not so many of them, but showed abusive behavior soon after the birth of their children. And since we don't know which of those guys would be which, led me to think we've got to do something to aim some prevention activities towards men during pregnancy. And so to begin that exploration, we did some interviews with 50 fathers. My colleagues and I won't name them all right now because of time. We went in and asked the men, asked their partners for permission to also talk to them right after they attended an ultrasound appointment. By the way, from our nationally representative survey of fathers with kids 0 to 3, we asked them if they had attended an ultrasound. 90% of men in the United States that have children 0 to 3 in our survey said that they had attended an ultrasound appointment. So if we want to find some men who might be targets for some prevention activity and prevent domestic violence during pregnancy or right after, that's a pretty good place to look. Anyways, we talked to them, their partners, and we didn't think they would have much to say. Oh, but boy, did they have a lot to say when we just asked them some simple questions. And I highlighted the 2 questions that are maybe the most relevant to this presentation. What do you think you need to do to get ready to become a father? And think of the things you said you need to do. How likely are you to make those changes? And here's what we heard, again, in great brief issues here. They talked about, we never said a word about trauma. We never said a word about harmful or past experiences that they might have had. But the men talked about absent fathers and mothers, abusive and neglectful parents, violence towards women in their family, not that they themselves perpetrated, but had been directed towards women in their lives, exposure to violent environments, pregnancy and child-related traumas that had occurred in previous pregnancies, harsh parenting that they experienced, parental separation. These were on men's minds as they pondered what it was going to be like to become a dad themselves. They also reported spontaneous, well, we did ask them in this case. In our first study, we didn't ask this question, but that's why we did in this study. What did they intend to change? And they talked about changing their substance use and abuse, taking better care of themselves, paying more attention to the needs of their partner, preparing for the baby, and then also what I call renunciations. They talked a lot about what they weren't gonna do anymore, like renouncing swearing. I stopped swearing, I stopped getting mad because I don't want her, that's the baby, to be hearing that kind of language. You know, while she's in there, she's safe from the world. I'm determined to keep it that way. They renounced being right, at least some of the men. Sometimes we get in arguments and make sure that I put my opinions in the back seat temporarily because I don't want to upset her for unnecessary reasons. And and more. I'm going fast. I apologize. Not so importantly, maybe they renounce sports, but sports are really important to men. And anybody who works with men knows that that's one of the places that you can really engage or talk about things that matter to men. And so metaphors, sports metaphors can figure into our ways of engaging. Anyways, this guy said, I need to give up playing basketball as often because I got to be ready for the baby. But also renouncing substance abuse and harmful networks. I've lost a lot of friends voluntarily because I don't believe their influences on me when I'm having a child. You know, people who you drink too much or use narcotics. And we heard a lot of that. Almost 25% of the men that we talked to mentioned changing their substance use, kind of as they pondered becoming a father. Now, are these men going to make all those changes? I don't think so, but they're thinking about it and they're motivated. And I think, so I'm just using this as an example of one of the lessons that maybe fathering can be a site of our interventions and our attempts to situate our work outside of the criminal legal system. Because if we start to talk to men as they're thinking about becoming dads, and we can know how to find them and where to look for them when they're in that process, maybe we can begin some prevention efforts that can head off their use of violence. Or if they're already using violence in their relationships, we can do some things to further intervene. And there's a couple of resources that I put on the slide for you to check out. One's The Futures Without Violence, has a lot of materials on working with fathers and in fatherhood programs to address domestic violence. And also this men's care campaign, which is part of Men Engage. Here's one of the posters from that. Involving men in committed, responsible, empathetic fatherhood greatly reduces violence against children and women. I don't know that the data on that is so strong at this point, but that's a great aspiration and maybe something that can come to fruition. If we involve men in intimate caregiving, and that has an impact on reducing violence, then rather than depending on the criminal legal system to round up people after they've committed violence, we might be on the way to a gender transformative type of intervention and prevention that will ultimately reduce violence and increase gender equality, because men will be doing more of the work that women unfairly have to deal with. And here's some of the posters that come from that international campaign. The recognition that there was this great work going on globally led me and some of my colleagues to think about how we might understand what was happening in this global movement to involve men and boys to end gender-based violence. We launched a global survey, had several hundred men who were doing this kind of work, or people who identified as men around the world fill out the survey. Just one of the brief takeaways I want to say is that one of the things that people agreed within every region, that the best way to start discussions with men in these gender transformative ways is to talk about what does it mean for what is healthy masculinity, and also to talk about being fathers are the top ways to engage men. And some of the initiatives that have been developed in the world, we're usually thinking we export our interventions. There's a lot to be learned from paying attention to what people are doing globally and trying to port them into our work in the United States. And there's an example of that. I put the reference for it, of adopting one of these global gender transformative initiatives in a large scale community effort in Pittsburgh. I said I would talk about trauma in this presentation because it's beginning to get a lot of attention in the domestic violence world, both in working with survivors and also in working with people who cause harm. And people who cause harm report high levels of ACEs and other traumatic and harmful life experiences, and the difficulties that result from their early trauma often don't resolve when abused children. Those are the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, when they reach adulthood. And I think we know that, that both childhood and adult trauma could be linked with abusive and violent behavior. I mean, we care a lot about kids who are exposed to domestic violence, and we recognize the harm that it can do. It doesn't magically, unfortunately, resolve itself without intervention when those kids reach adulthood. And I think those of us who've done the work with men who cause harm in groups know how much is generated when we start to talk about their own experiences as children being exposed to violence, the pledges that they made to never grow up to be that guy. But here they are in the room, and that paradox and that tragedy is one of the things we have to dig in to try to change. So people who've experienced trauma are more likely to experience threats in their environment due to their prior experience of trauma. That can impact their physiological and cognitive processes. They read social cues in ways that are that they misperceive and inappropriately respond to with aggression. This extends to all kinds of traumas, not just physical abuse, but traumas can alter core beliefs and emotions that are regarding safety and closeness and trust and power and control. Those are all things that are in the room when we're trying to help people change their harmful behavior. Also lead to depression, substance abuse, traumatic brain injuries that can also elevate risk for being at harm. I don't think any client that we see or participant we see in our programs is without any prior trauma or other life events. Steve Hawley, I think, was mentioning this in his presentation yesterday. That would be a rarity to find that. Diagnosis isn't necessary to think about trauma because just about everybody who's going to be come to attention from causing harm has probably experienced some of that harm themselves. And there's also, of course, oppression as trauma. Experiencing oppression and racism at the individual and institutional level is traumatic, and understanding that and validating it and understanding the ways in which it plays out in the currently in relationships is really important for us to focus on. But there's a lot of concern about doing this because we're concerned about attributing cause to trauma. We're worried about it becoming an excuse or something that replaces accountability for abusive behavior, or even just taking the focus off of our interventions on abusive behavior and ending up talking more about what's happened to somebody rather than what they're doing. So if we're going to focus on trauma and situate programs outside of the criminal legal system, how can we be confident that accountability will stay central to the work? And so I want to talk a little bit about accountability, very little because my time is running out, but we sometimes use the metaphor of holding someone accountable, and that implies an external kind of accountability. We're doing the accounting, we're the accounters, and we're going to hold someone accountable. And that often can get based in notions of retribution or punishment for past actions. Jeffrey Cape and David Garvin, David's on the call, I believe, outlined quite a while ago a really important concept of internal accountability, actions towards or involving others that reflect the integrity of the person that you want to be. That's a really beautiful statement of accountability. It emphasizes that action's critical. It sets a standard that's both individualized and strengths-based. And it says that for action to run true, it needs to be consistent with participants' personal standards, linking it to their goals and to their visions of what it takes to be the kind of human being they aspire to be. That creates internal motivation. And we need to look at that as a forward-looking trait, not being accountable for past behaviors, though repairing damage from past behavior is one of the actions we want people to take. But it really puts the focus on the future, how to become forward-looking and living accountably. And there's been some recent work and theorizing about the conditions needed for accountability. This comes out not in the IPV field or partner violence field, but more generally. I think these are some concepts for us to think about and ponder. The person to whom you're accountable must have proper standing. That means they have to have some authority that is respected. And they have to be a good person. By that, I mean they have to care about the accountee. And the accounter has to be accountable and competent in what they're accounting for. They have to be able to walk the walk, not just talk the talk themselves. And they got to use their influence in a legitimate way. And the goal must be good. I don't think it's accountability when somebody says, remember, he reads the transcripts just before someone's testifying, because the goal isn't good. That might sound like accountability. I'm going to hold you accountable for what you say, but the goal is not good. And who has standing as an accounter and a good person? Well, for some people, a very important source is a transcendent authority, either a faith-based or non-religious spiritual belief that harmful behaviors in relationships are not acceptable to that transcendent authority. And when we can tap that, and when that's inconsistent with that belief, then I think there's something to build on. There's also secular authority. That's what we mostly depend on in our programs. And helpers can gain standing or diminish their standing as an accounter, depending on the context and how they act towards the accountee. If we're aligned with illegitimate authority, our secular authority is going to diminish. And that's where maybe some of the critiques of the criminal justice system come in. If there's buy-in to the legitimacy of the authority, maybe that can be helpful. Like the police arrest study showed that people who have a stake in conformity, arrests deterred their behavior. But for people who didn't have that stake in conformity, sometimes their abuse even actually increased after arrest. Harsh or punitive or disrespectful treatment and lack of competence or misalignment with these goals, those can diminish our secular authority. So I'm just almost out of time, I see, but I want to call attention to a couple things so if we're going to have standing, we have to think about our alliance and our engagement. And there's some trauma-centered ideas on this slide about doing that. We have to be cognizant that when people are in fear or in hostile settings, they shut down. If we want them to have access to their prefrontal cortex and not depend on their lower brain functions, which are impacted by trauma, then we need to find ways to help them regulate themselves so they can restore their ability to have access to the thinking brain. And so if we're going to build, maybe I can sum up and just take a couple more minutes to talk about a few things that
Rich, you're down to 30 seconds. I'm so sorry.
Well, if accountability is not a punitive, external, or unidirectional process, but rather a relational, reciprocal process, and if the capacity for accountability requires a capacity for empathy and regulation, then I think the dichotomy of mental health focus and accountability dissolves, because fostering empathy and emotional regulation becomes a critical part of helping someone who's deficient in those capacities, as trauma-exposed children and adults might be, to become accountable. So we're going to pay attention to those things to help people build accountability, not because we think that they cause domestic violence. And I'll just call your attention to a few more slides, which I think if you read through them can make the points about how we care without colluding, the importance of the group as an accounter, and how we have to build our conditions within the group to foster that. And finally, if we wait for arrest to round up the clients and have the court send them to us, we put survivors at risk, place the responsibility on them. Arrest is never someone's first time causing harm. And the longer we wait, the larger the harm and the more difficult the change process becomes. So we need more prevention efforts. We need voluntary programs that outside of the criminal legal system. There's some funding traps for that, because if we only get funded for court mandated clients, then we're going to even be more dependent on those systems to send us clients. So we need to think about funding models that give us sustainability in programs that are existing outside of court mandated realms. And I'm out of time. Thank you so much for listening to me talk so fast.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone. We have one more session. And Terry, do you want to give us any directions?
Yeah, so thank you, Rich. I really appreciate it. I know that it was a really short time, but we have our last session for the conference, which is now with Ebony Isis Booth, and it is awareness, alignment, and action. So this is a self-care session. It's going to be really amazing to end the conference in a really positive way, to be excited and go back to your communities and take back what you all learned. So we will be ending this session and head over to Ebony's session now. Thank you so much.
And Rich, you see there's all kinds of thank yous coming up in the chat there. Hope you can see
Thanks.
that.
I was looking at those. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Sorry that it was so quick, but I'll, if anybody has questions, please send them to me.
Thank you. And we'll see you all in the next session.